Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa, Idris, with me Sharaad, Kuttan, and on the show with us we have Laurence Todd from the think tank Ideas. Now, Ideas recently put out a position paper on making shared prosperity a reality ahead of Budget 2020, and they made some interesting proposals. I'd like to talk to you about some of the proposals and the problems that they are trying to address. So first of all, the idea of having or proposing a new living wage tax credit. So this is to address the problem that minimum wage is not enough, not sufficient, but yet increasing the minimum wage would be an imposition or difficult for some businesses to implement. So tell us a little bit about this proposal.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think you set out the context perfectly. I think we see that there is this problem of low pay in Malaysia. You know, actually, when you compare Malaysia internationally, it seems there's this sort of structural problem in people getting paid relative to how much they produce. So if you produce $100 worth of goods in the US, you might get paid, say, $60, whereas in Malaysia, if you produce $100, you might get paid $30. And that gap is particularly bad in the lowest paid sectors. So therefore, you'd say, well, we need to raise the minimum wage. But on the flip side, we also know that our SMEs are really squeezed, you know, business investment is tight. So how do we kind of find a middle path between those two constituencies?
I wonder sometimes maybe this document ought to have been called a shared reality vision, because I don't know we actually have a shared or common perception of the Malaysian economy. It seems like a lot of people, and in government as well, seem to have a very different idea or different ideas about how the economy works. And we look at, for instance, the recent debacle over Food Panda and those interventions, right? Does government intervene to create or enable, or are they there to micromanage? I mean, so on and so forth. I mean, how do you see some of your proposals, your ideas proposal? I mean, where does it come from? And what understanding of the Malaysian economy do you have? Right,
so I think the general picture would be this, which is that we need to transition in Malaysia from a model where the government directs the big moving parts of the economy to create outcomes that it wants, to a system whereby the Malaysian government sets the rules, regulates the market, and then allows that process to then evolve more naturally. I think that's where we need to get to from the prosperity perspective in terms of where future growth is going to be driven in the Malaysian economy. At the same time, we have to recognize that, you know, we need to get that shared bit as well, right? So we have to build rules that are fair for everybody. So, you know, another proposal that we put in there was, or two linked ideas perhaps. Firstly is to reform the tax system and to introduce a capital gains tax. Now, this is quite controversial in the Malaysian context. This has been raised before.
Yes. Business communities might not be, you know.
And some part of the M40 as well. I mean, it seems like
right.
the most neglected of the constituent parts of Malaysia.
Or most squeezed part.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
Equally squeezed or squeezed in different ways is the M40, right? I mean, is there anything in the Shared Prosperity Vision 2030 for the M40?
Well, look, I mean, from our perspective, I would say that, so what we've tried to think about is, okay, right, at the bottom end, we want to increase wages. And hopefully that would have an impact up the distribution, up into the M40. At the M40, I would say one of the key issues is actually, rather than income distribution, it's wealth distribution. So we see very high concentration of wealth among the very, very richest. Something like 22% of Malaysia's GDP is controlled by like the top 40 people. So a real skew to the top. So for the M40...
Not top 40%, but just top 40
people.
Individuals.
Individuals, exactly.
Right.
So what we've talked about in our position paper and our recommendation to the government is, okay, how do we maybe try and release or encourage Malaysia's wealth to be allocated directly to employees? So we're looking at incentive schemes for employers to give shares essentially to their employees. Now, I think in practice, this is probably a policy that would benefit the M40 rather than the B40, because it's probably going to be for employees in larger companies, right? So I think what we're trying to look at there is, how do you address wealth distribution? Because we've got to look at both the income side and the wealth side. So I do think there is this need for shared prosperity to provide, you know, at the very bottom, we're talking about poverty eradication. A little bit higher up, we're talking about raising incomes. A little bit higher up than that, we're talking about, you know, improving savings and wealth. And then right at the top, we're talking about a little bit more tax.
Okay. So on that note, I mean, I'd just like you to finish your thought from earlier about, your proposal of having kind of two-prong, right? So having this reform of the tax system and this capital gains tax. I believe the finance minister has already come out to say no new taxes in budget 2020, but I mean, the reality is the government needs revenue and the tax base in Malaysia is undeniably small. So how do we address those kind of conflicting ideas?
Yeah, well, look, I think, actually we published a follow-up paper to this actually only just this week where we focusing just on tax. And we reiterated the point there about a capital gains tax and how we think it can be consistent with a kind of pro-growth model, because you rein in some of the speculative investment when the economy is overheating, and then you also have this cushion to encourage investors not to pull out their capital when the economy is slowing down. So it kind of keeps Malaysia in what we call a growth corridor. Probably the other thing we could look at doing, and I know this is quite controversial, is the reintroduction of the GST.
Why do you say that this is something we should look at?
Well, look, I mean, actually, as ideas, we were quite torn on this, because as economists, we think the GST is the right policy, but as Democrats, we know that the public is opposed and therefore it has to be abolished. So what we would encourage the government to look at now is how could you address some of the concerns. So I think, coming back to what you were saying, which is, how much of this problems fall on the M40, what's in shared prosperity for the M40. I think one of the objections to GST was that was a tax that largely fell on the M40. It was the people who are buying. So how can you introduce some fairness into it? So we're looking at having higher rates for luxury consumption, for example. So like under the SST, actually things like lobster, quinoa, salmon are all 0 rated. But actually if these were subject to a higher rate, 15%, 20%, so that you kind of geared the GST a bit more to the higher income households.
Is lobster 0%?
Yeah, exactly. So there's actually a lot that you could do, just tightening up the current system, I think. Okay. But if you geared more fairness into the tax system, I think you'd also get greater democratic consent for it. And then you don't have this problem of seesawing with the tax system. So.
I wonder if we could just, for a moment, look at the external environment that Malaysia, and to what extent does the Shared Prosperity Vision document even acknowledge the external environment in a way that is sufficient? Because we have regional competitors, nobody has to come either buy from Malaysia or invest in Malaysia. What is addressed in that document?
I think probably the current vision is quite narrow in that respect. I don't think there's enough recognition of Malaysia's position in the world and how the global economy is changing. And I think that there are risks for Malaysia there, because you've got people hot on the heels in terms of being able to compete on the basis of low labor costs and all those kind of areas, but Malaysia's sort of struggling to move itself into that sort of top tier of development. Now, of course, the Shared Prosperity Vision does talk about increasing kind of value add industries, moving up the value chain in these export sectors. But I think here more than anywhere else, it really comes down to, okay, but what specifically are you going to do? Because there are choices. Right. So we've talked about the trade deals already. There are still a number of quite large investment restrictions that apply in Malaysia that could be looked at. Of course, the role of the GLCs, the government-linked companies, is a very significant issue when it comes to how Malaysia is viewed by investors and so on. So it feels like this is a relatively narrow document and its focus is largely domestic, and it's to a degree relatively blind to what's happening out in the wider world. Of course, there are general
commitments. But isn't that a fatal flaw? I mean, to be blind to the general environment in an open capitalist economy is an extraordinary oversight, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, like, maybe blind is too strong. I mean, I think the central goal of the document, which is about trying to, have a more highly educated workforce, more technology adoption, all these things are great, but they're great as goals. The question is, are you going to take the hard choices in policy terms? And I think that's also where, looking at how the global environment is changing. I mean, so one example is, when we talk about infant industry protection, so of course in the case of the national car, the way global manufacturing has changed so much even since the 80s, it's so much more integrated now. You can't just wall yourself off and say, we're going to build this one thing really well and protect it from all the competition and then unveil it when it's ready, because global production has become so integrated. Right. So actually it's much more important now to find your niche within the supply chain and then develop from there, rather than try and hive yourself off and just focus on one product. So I do think there's this lack of reality maybe when it comes to how Malaysia integrates with the broader global economy, and a lack of clarity on these kind of big policy questions around trade and investment.
Okay, we're going to come back and continue that look on the lack of clarity and also the realities of the Malaysian economy heading towards Budget 2020 with in full view of the shared prosperity vision. We're going to continue that conversation in just a couple of minutes, so stay tuned to consider this.